And in fact, the saddest thing on Black Friday was that when we were in with the president of the company and we were holding a wake, if you like, on the announcement, and I couldn't believe it. I just went to, you know, almost was sick on the thing of what do we do with all these people and what do we do with my 1,500 engineers. My chief engineer came in, who had been preparing the 206, which had the Aerocar engine in for first flight. And he said, I've heard about the cancellation. Can I fly 206? In other words, can I continue with the preparation of 206 for flight? And after consultation with Johnny Plant, who was the president of the company, and the other directors, I just had to go and tell Bob Lindley, no, you can't fly that aircraft. So in fact, the aircraft, which would have bettered the specification, was a phenomenal aircraft, an all-Canadian project with a Canadian airframe, Canadian engine, never flew.
In a warehouse in Ottawa is all that remains of Arrow 206, the plane that never flew. There are those who believe that with the Iroquois engine, it would have set world records for altitude and speed. And the Iroquois? It's now an exhibit in the Aeronautical Collection in Ottawa. There is no plaque to identify it. It seems a curious way to honor our achievements. And we still ask the question, what finally killed the Arrow?
I think it's a very difficult question to answer. I felt personally, even though I was involved with it, the program should never have been started in Canada in the first place because it was just too expensive for us. However, it was started, and if they'd maintained it at its original idea, this might have gone through. But then when they added the cost of developing the Sparrow 2 and the cost of an Astra fire control system, this just added to the cost. And if they hadn't been added, whether this would have made a difference, I don't know. But the other thing is that if the two opposing people, and let's face it, there was a lot of personalities involved in the cancellation with Mr. Diefenbaker and Crawford Gordon. And if either one of those two people had been different, and preferably both of them, the cancellation could not have happened. I think it was a very personal thing on this, in the final cancellation of the Arrow.
Men of different temperament, different background. Gordon, contemptuous of the prairie lawyer who didn't understand industry. Diefenbaker, suspicious of the aggressive tactics of a Bay Street whiz kid. There were stories of a famous meeting in September of 1958.
Although I'd never met Mr. Diefenbaker, I knew he had great respect for his office, for the office of Prime Minister. And I warned Gordon before he went to see him not to take a drink and not to smoke in his office, whatever he did. Well, Gordon must have been very belligerent. He had his half loaded when he got there. And he puffed smoke in the old man's face all the time. And it ended in quite a bitter argument. And what you would use the term that the president was thrown out.
But, you know, what's that got to do with the air defense policy of the government of Canada? Whether or not Diefenbaker and Gordon had a personality clash, the only time they met was on that occasion, September the 17th, for about 20 minutes.
That was their only meeting?
Yes. And what's it got to do with the air defense policy of Canada, or the Arrow, or anything else?
I haven't any idea the real reason for the cancellation. So many reasons have been given. Mr. Diefenbaker even said that the chiefs of staff said he didn't want the airplane. Well, I don't believe that. I think the real reason for the cancellation was the fact that they weren't sure that it was going to cost what we thought it was going to cost. And secondly, that Mr. Diefenbaker wanted to save some money somewhere. What is going to be done with the money, I don't know. But it has been stated to me by a man who now past the Great Divide, who was in the know, that for about $50 million more than we'd already spent, plus the cancellation charges which we were going to spend, that we could have had as many arrows as we had voodoos.
2 years later, Canada took possession of 66 second-hand Voodoos bought from the Americans in a package deal. The Voodoo was vastly inferior to the Arrow, but the price was right. And what would C.D. Howe have done had the Liberals remained in power? In January 1959, he wrote to his leader, Lester Pearson, "There is no doubt in my mind that the CF-105 should be terminated. Costs are completely out of hand." In this, the Liberals and the Tories were in agreement.
It was an inevitable decision. No other decision under the circumstances could have been responsibly made. Had we done something else, it would have simply meant taxing the people of Canada to go on manufacturing planes for which there would never be a market outside Canada. And the Royal Canadian Air Force could only absorb so many. And as a matter of fact, it was around this time that the whole role of the fighter aircraft had to be re-examined, because our concept of the defense of Canada in relation to a possible attack changed from fear of the man bomber to fear of missiles. And the Avro Arrow would never have been any use to us as a defense against missiles.
Last September, I made it perfectly clear that having regard to the development that was then taking place, particularly in intercontinental ballistic missiles, that there was a probability that action would have to be taken in this regard. And that's the reason for the action. We were loath to take it.
The Prime Minister used not money, but the missile threat as the major reason for the cancellation. In place of the Arrow, we acquired the Beaumark missile from the United States.
The part that upset me was basically in being asked to give some rationale behind the decision other than cost. And we really couldn't do it because it was simply a cost matter. And then Mr. Diefenbaker making the statement that the introduction of the Beaumark was the reason for canceling the Arrow, that it was a better interceptor, if you will, and more effective, and therefore the Arrow could be canceled. That argument was a very specious one, and literally had no fact whatsoever.
The RCAF was caught in the politics of the cancellation. Air Marshal Campbell was accused of not fighting hard enough for the Arrow. Today, he is reluctant to get involved in the controversy again. But he has told us that contrary to statements made by the Prime Minister, the Chiefs of Staff did not make a recommendation to cancel the Arrow, and that he offered his resignation if the Arrow were canceled without provision for an alternative fighter. The alternative was the Voodoo and the Beaumark, and the Beaumark was a failure. This model met the same fate as Arrow 206, lying a few meters away in the same warehouse. Whatever the Beaumark was, it was no replacement for the Arrow. There was still another reason offered by the government for the cancellation. They tried to sell the Arrow before it entered squadron service, and they found they couldn't.
Now, I went down to the United States in September and had conversations with their Secretary of Defense, find out whether they would be interested in our 105, see whether they'd be willing to purchase the 105 for even some of their squadrons. And the answer that I received was that they were not prepared at that time to do so.
Mr. Perks, I reiterate, is a gentleman. I have the highest regard for him as a person. But he was a permanent Army officer. He'd been retired from that for some time. He was over 70 years old, and he didn't know one end of an airplane from another. He had no appreciation of the industrial implications. He wasn't in a position to discuss the Arrow or any aspect of it.
And
there was another attempt to sell the Arrow. In the winter of 1958, Donald Fleming and two other ministers met with their American counterparts in Paris to discuss defense. Fleming told them that the future of the Arrow might depend on sales to the U.S. It was hardly a strong selling point.
At the conclusion of my statement, Mr. Robert Anderson, the U.S. Secretary of the Treasury, who was my opposite number in that committee, gave me the answer no. It was an unconditional, uncompromising, and final answer. It was the decision of the United States government not to purchase the Arrow. And that decision spelled the doom of the Arrow program.
Paul Hellyer, who later ran as a conservative, was liberal defense critic in opposition in 1959, and he still maintains that the government did not make the right kind of effort to sell the Arrow.